Good evening. I'm Albert Carnesdale, the Dean of the John F. Kennedy School of Government. Welcome to tonight's forum, which is sponsored by the Institute of Politics and the Kennedy School. I have a wonderful quote from John Updike. He wrote, "A leader is one who, out of madness or goodness, volunteers to take upon himself the woe of a people." Close quote. Our guest tonight, the House Majority Leader of the United States Congress, has come to leadership at a time in our nation's history that seems at least as woeful as any other in our recent history. Indeed, it's pretty easy these days to criticize our Congress, just as it's easy to criticize the executive branch or the judiciary, perhaps even more so than usual, until one realizes the enormity of the task before them. From the wounds that have been opened across our country this past week to the global challenges we face in the economy, in the environment, and in other areas. Over the years, constituents and colleagues have chosen our guest to provide leadership in difficult times. And most recently, his colleagues have chosen him for one of their most demanding positions, Majority Leader, whose job has been described as the one who has to keep all the bunnies in the box. Born in St. Louis, he began his political career as an alderman in 1971. He had his eyes on the mayor's seat when in 1976 the 3rd District Congressional seat opened up. He ran and he won. He was appointed to the Ways and Means Committee in his freshman year when there were more than 100 freshman and sophomore Democrats in the House. Over the years, he's carved out a niche as an astute, moderate Democrat, a master of the rules, and one who enjoys mucking around in the political trenches of the Congress. As a national figure, he's identified with a number of issues, most especially tax reform, foreign trade, and aid to the former Soviet Union in Central and Eastern Europe. He's earned special respect in this school for having gone head-to-head against Richard Darman during the 1990 budget compromise. As you know, Richard Darman was a member of the faculty of this school, and we know how hard that head is. A graduate of Northwestern University and of the University of Michigan Law School, I'm told that his true ambition over the years has shifted from playing on, later to managing, and now to someday owning the St. Louis Cardinals. Won't you join me in welcoming Congressman Richard Gephardt?
Thank you, Dean, very much for that splendid introduction. It's indeed an honor to be here this evening, and I appreciate very much this opportunity. I'm always appreciative since 1988 of being properly introduced. After you've run for president, as I did in 1988, and failed, as I did, thereafter, when you go out into public, into restaurants and airports, people see you, and they know they've seen you somewhere else. Maybe you're a talk show host. One woman thought I was the weather person on Channel 5 in Chicago. Even a game show host sometimes. But recently I was on TWA going back to St. Louis from Washington. St. Louis is my home. And TWA is having troubles. And the stewards and stewardesses, sometimes even the pilots, come back, and usually, hopefully not all of them at once, and they talk to me about TWA. This particular night, a steward knelt down beside me. I was on the aisle, and we had a long conversation about TWA and the St. Louis airport. When he finished, a woman three rows behind came up and knelt down. She said, "You know, when I got on this plane, I saw you, and you looked so familiar, and I just knew I knew who you were, but I couldn't put the face with the name, and it just driving me nuts." She said, "Finally, I overheard a little of your conversation. I heard St. Louis," and she said, "Then it clicked." She said, "I want you to know what a thrill it was when you hit that home run in the All-Star game." in 1950. If you're a Cardinal fan, you know that she thought I was Red Shandies. And that isn't too bad. You know, this is not a real great year for politicians. I always wanted to be a Cardinal ball player, so I didn't tell her otherwise. She still thinks she saw Red Shandies. But it's a great pleasure to be here tonight. Arriving to see the serene beauty of Cambridge from the chaos and distemper of Washington, watching the joggers run this morning along the Charles River, the young people sitting in Harvard Yard this afternoon, the professors who said they were glad to see me, and the students who were preoccupied with their work, only one thought crossed my mind. How do I apply for political asylum? My application may well be rejected by you once you hear what I have to say. Sometime around the 1st of June, both houses of Congress will begin debating and in all likelihood will pass by the required two-thirds vote a constitutional amendment to require a balanced federal budget. Yes, I said pass. When that occurs, there will be the predictable negative reaction from the usual sources of responsible concern. Economists will decry our removing government fiscal policy from the possibility of affecting the economy. Purists will see the amendment as a profane act of constitutional graffiti. Liberal court watchers will warn that Clarence Thomas and William Rehnquist should not be writing opinions about what constitutes an outlay or an obligation. Organized interests will mobilize to protect such interests as the B-2 bomber or the school lunch program. Cynics will accuse Congress of a craven act designed to shift the public's attention from the House bank to an unworkable gimmick. And columnists will blame the dumb voters who wanted more in services while paying less in taxes and whose avarice produced the exact opposite result. This debate and the comments that will inevitably follow will herald only the latest chapter in the monotonous, ongoing national discussion over divided government, the problems of timid leadership, and the trouble with middle-class people who can't accept what elite opinion makers know they need, namely more pain. I want to defend the public tonight and try to put some context about what I think is really happening in Washington. The problem is not the public or their desires. The problem principally is two public institutions, political leaders and the political process for failing to provide adequate alternatives to the status quo or communicating the consequences of decisions made in Washington, and the press, which seems to be losing its objective ability to inform and educate. There's no way I can answer all the questions or even raise most of the questions. But let's begin by thinking about why the voters are angry. And believe me, they're angry. And what they're really angry about. As the social historian David Potter reminded us in his book, People of Plenty, the secret of our democracy has not just been freedom and individualism. It's also been the politics of abundance. Our character as a country has always depended on keeping and widening the promises of opportunity and decent life. In recent years, with the virtual collapse of economic growth, the decline of real incomes for almost everyone, but especially families with children, and an outrageous concentration of wealth in the hands of the top 1% of earners, American families no longer feel secure about themselves or the future. They feel as if they have lost control of their destiny. In many different ways, a poorer America has to be a place of lesser liberty. You can sense the danger all across the land. We saw it in Los Angeles amidst the anger and the pain of the Rodney King case. On Tuesday, the President raised $9 million at a dinner where the company of executive branch officials was auctioned to donors. On Thursday, cities across America erupted as a partial consequence of the President's neglect of the cities and his politics of racial division. We learned yet again what the last 12 years have meant to this country. Too many of our people now regard each other as economic adversaries. The gulf of suspicion and fear widens, and the bonds of civility are frayed, and so is the confidence the people have in the possibility of opportunity, in the competence of public institutions to improve their lives, and the wisdom of investing a portion of our resources in a humane public agenda. They hate politics, not because they're ill-informed, but because they know it too well. Government is not working for them, and awesome problems like declining living standards and controlling health care costs are not being addressed, and in some ways are not even being talked about. Voters believe that 40 cents of every dollar collected by the government is now wasted, and there's a deep logic in their position that citizens' taxes are too high and the services they pay for are ineffective or inefficient. They're being cheated by our fiscal profligacy, with an annual deficit topping $400 billion. Long-term interest rates are driven artificially high, and the $300 billion a year that we now spend in debt service in the annual budget makes honoring our current spending commitments difficult and funding new priorities absolutely impossible. With this paralysis and waste comes an even deeper cost to our national esteem. Our citizens hear politicians and business leaders in Asia and Europe talk about America as an anachronism. Their national leadership behaves in ways that ensure David Letterman, Dennis Miller, Phil, and Oprah are never at loss for a laugh. The people properly object to the endless nature of campaigns, their escalating costs, and the chase for dollars by elected officials. And some are prepared to entrust the presidency to a crusty billionaire with no political party, at least till today, no platform, and little experience in crafting a legislative compromise or defying an organized interest group that might allow a compromise to be written. But beneath the frustration, beyond the alienation, I think there is a more profound feeling. People do not want government to fail. They want it rather to succeed. They want a smart government, not a dumb one. They want an effective government, not an ineffective government. They want leaders who provide direction, not drift. They want a government that invests, not one that wastes. They know that American businesses are going through big changes, especially layoffs and other changes to revive themselves. And they wonder why government can't do the same. What they don't realize is that many who work in government wonder the same thing. The fiscal fraud that started in 1981 has been revealed, and the Trojan horse predictions by David Stockman have been borne out. 3/4 of our accumulated public debt comes from deficits the Republicans created since 1981. The deficits created by the original Reagan tax cuts and defense increases passed at the same time have made funding adequate levels of domestic spending nearly impossible. Reagan bankrupted the country to this end, and George Bush is merely the logical heir and custodian of this legacy. and he perpetuates the paralysis by indiscriminately vetoing proposals for progress by the remaining locus of activism, the Congress. These policies have had the predicted and predictable effects on people in Congress. Sincere legislators with grand ideas about how to change the country for the better have instead spent their time working at the margins, trimming some programs to save others, patching holes in the safety net, floating good ideas only to see them vetoed, and fighting special interest groups over ideas like national health insurance that seem far from resolution. A record number of Congress people are retiring, and dozens of others wish they were. They're exhausted by the gridlock, by feelings of powerlessness, by anger at divided government, and by guilt over what the job that they have chosen is doing to their own family. As we are unable to do things that are meaningful, we are constantly reminded of how small our politics has become. Our lives as legislators are overtaken by institutional problems, problems that should have been addressed earlier and corrected only belatedly, but issues that simply aren't as important as the larger crises facing our country, regardless of what some in the press and the public might otherwise believe. Because our current system of divided government allows the Congress and the President to dodge accountability for deadlock and inaction. Public support for government as an instrument of social advancement is disappearing. As Woodrow Wilson said in Congressional Government, I quote, "In any business, whether government or mere merchandising, somebody must be trusted in order that when things go wrong, it might be quite plain who should be punished. Power and strict accountability for its use are the essential constituents of good government." But the people are clearly confused over who is responsible and who is to blame for the problems we perceive, and their natural position is to junk the whole thing. As campaigns and governing, elections and outcomes become more wildly disconnected, the public and public officials become more dissatisfied and suspicious of each other. And much of the suspicion and dissatisfaction is being fed by the performance of the national press. Despite their oft-repeated denials, the press profoundly affects public opinion. The media performs what the journalism expert Max McCombs calls an agenda-setting function. He said the issues on which citizens and voters hold opinions, the agenda of concerns around which public opinion forms, are seldom amenable to direct experience. Issues in the public arena and beliefs we hold about them are conformed by the media filter. That is the source of the press's power to inform and educate, or to distort and degrade the information citizens need about their government and about their country. All of us sense the press is different these days, and there are about 1,000 explanations why. It's become instant, international, intrusive. News programming is designed to shock, coax emotional reactions from readers and viewers, and raise ratings and circulation. The press is more tied to big corporations and the financial considerations of the firms which own them. Time magazine, for example, reduced the number of reporters in its Washington bureau substantially in the wake of the costly Time-Warner merger. Driven by polls and ratings, technology and competition, the search for information that is scandalous, superficial, and speedily delivered has become paramount over standards, sources, and substance. The reporters I deal with often know the score, know the impact on their craft, and they don't like it. One respected Capitol Hill magazine correspondent says, "I know how hard it is to sell a serious story." Another well-known political writer, upon hearing that the Democratic caucus welcomed Governor Clinton last week with open arms, responded, "No story there." In my colleagues' views, serious issues consistently fail to get not only serious attention, but any attention. Legislative debates, like political campaigns, get reported as horse races. Who won, who lost, rather than what was at stake or what was the issue about. We've seen historic efforts like our recent $100 billion higher education bill reduced to paragraph blurbs in the newspapers and never ever mentioned on television. This often leaves the impression with our constituents that we're not addressing the problems that they care about because they never read about it and they never hear about it. A gentleman I know at a local TV station explains just how ratings-driven local news broadcasts have become. They're now testing stories on local news during Sweeps Week by Nielsen to determine a profile for those stories which engage the biggest audiences. And that's how decisions are made about what stories get run. Once they develop a ratings profile for various kinds of stories, the assignment desk, the reporters and editors then have a better idea of what sort of news the station is actually looking for. And then they tell us what's news, not on the basis of what's important or what people want to know, but what panders best to our emotions and our preferences and our purchases. Millions of Americans know what Bill Clinton said to his draft board, but they don't know what he wrote in his application to the Rhodes Scholarship Division. Millions know about the allegations of a tabloid, but few know that he's a doting father who, as a governor, took his daughter to school every day. Dozens of stories have been written about what his advisors and his handlers are doing, but how many Americans know about his record, his actual record, as governor of Arkansas in the area of education or health or anything else? Most Americans know everything they could possibly imagine about the governor, except the very details that might shed light on how he would actually perform as a president. Larry Sabato, in his great book entitled Feeding Frenzy, said it well. He said the press invasion of privacy is leading to the gradual erasure of the line protecting a public person's purely private life. He said this makes the price of public life enormously higher, serving as an even greater deterrent for those not absolutely obsessed with holding power, the kind of people we ought least to want in office. The sad conclusion is inescapable. He said the press has become obsessed with gossip rather than governance. In the competition between scandals and substance, we all know what sells. I don't mean the press has to be partisan, has to stop criticizing Congress, has to ruin their company's finances, or present their readers and viewers with just formats that copy the New Yorker or McNeil Lehrer. The press is diverse, not monolithic. Homogeneity won't work, and it shouldn't be tried. But in its plural voices and formats, the press must learn to reward excellence and courage. It ought to pander less to public opinion and attend more to the national interest. We need more substance, more willingness to decode complexity, and more reinforcement for brave responses by leaders who seek to meet national needs. Although I, as a public official, am clearly a suspect carrier of this message, that doesn't diminish its value or its salience. Today I recommend it, and tomorrow I hope the public demands it. I wish the press would broaden the public's appreciation of what they mean when they invoke the word character. Does it apply equally to people who have healed a troubled marriage and to someone Who armed Iraq and then sent young American men and women into a battle against the recipient of those arms? Does it apply to a candidate who tells all white and all black audiences that racial harmony is a value he will uphold as president, as well as to someone who signed legislation he once called a quota bill when David Duke made playing the race card unpopular? Of course, character matters, but it should be defined broadly and applied fairly. You may write all of what I'm saying off as press bashing, but that would be wrong. These issues matter to me. Rather than retiring or running for higher office, I am hoping to work a while longer on Capitol Hill in a search for solutions, in a fight to elect a Democratic president, in an effort to end the gridlock and restore America's faith in our ability to govern ourselves. And the only way to restore the public's confidence in government is to earn it. And these are some ways I believe that goal might be achieved. It's no accident that the highest approval ratings Congress has had in 30 years were recorded by Lewis Harris in 1964 and 1965, coincident with the adoption of the Great Society. This was the last productive era of cooperation between the Congress and the executive branch. The public responded positively, not because the spending spigot was twisted open or because new bureaucracies were created, but because the government was standing for change, was standing for reform, and for hope and renewal. The Democratic Party hopes to persuade the voters to put Bill Clinton in the White House and renew Democratic control of the Congress by describing how our lives would be different under unified rather than divided government. Specifically, we in the Congress will move legislation to reform health care and to create new jobs by speeding up spending on infrastructure programs with the public support of our nominee. We plan to remind the public, even if the President will not, that domestic and foreign policies are inherently linked. To create the political climate in America for aid to the former Soviet Union, we will ensure equal attention is paid to the permanent extension of our existing unemployment compensation and for other means for stimulating growth and justice in our economy. By coordinating these legislative efforts with Governor Clinton, the public would have a concrete demonstration by one party and its nominee in advance of the election of what kind of future they would be choosing by voting for the Democratic ticket and unifying a government now divided between party lines. We will articulate sharply the powerful, positive consequences of voting Democratic. Our determination will offer a sharp contrast with the first campaign of the incumbent president, whose words and deeds suggested that he would make America safe for flag factories and dangerous for furloughed criminals, but who could not foresee the collapse of communism or the end of the business cycle. This effort may or may not win us the election, but if it makes the Republican team play on the field of issues, it will provide the nation with a campaign contested over ideas rather than over the most devastating 30-second spots. We need profound and comprehensive campaign finance reform. Fundraising and campaigns have become marathons without end. Our citizens are isolated and locked out of the process, and we feel insulated from the authenticity of their experience. We should have ended the dollar chase a long, long time ago. But now we have a special opportunity to act and restore confidence in our democratic system. The House and the Senate, and believe me, it was hard, have sent to the President legislation calling for comprehensive campaign reform. The centerpiece of our proposal, the strongest and most effective election reform in a generation, is a ceasefire in the proliferating arms race of campaign spending. We declare that ceasefire by imposing strict caps on what both challengers and incumbents can spend for seats in the House and the Senate in every election cycle. We limit political action fund contributions to campaigns. We encourage contributions by average citizens. We limit the influence of wealthy donors, and we reduce the cost of communicating with citizens through television. In short, these reforms are real, and they offer the country what I believe our citizens demand and deserve: more truly competitive elections. And if you don't think it would do that, you should have sat with me and listened to my colleagues who were worried that this bill would create too competitive of elections. But the President seems determined to veto this legislation, and if he does, I believe the Congress will be equally determined to pass it again. Beyond campaign reform, I also believe we must become the champions of sweeping government reform, not simply because it's desirable, but because it's necessary for our survival. It will be inspired by the radical changes in structure and outlook ongoing in the business community. It will be led by thinkers like David Osborne and by leaders like Governor Childs of Florida, by Chicago's Mayor Daley, who's privatized services, and by Leon Panetta, who's the chairman of our Budget Committee, and Bob Kerrey of Nebraska, and other reformers at the national level. We must be about reinventing government, borrowing where we can ideas from the private sector, such as total quality management. Government must practice what the private sector is relearning, namely treating citizens as responsively and efficiently as good business treats their best customers. This movement is already underway, but it will certainly be given greater urgency by the balanced budget debate. When the constitutional amendment is considered, I will be asking the leadership to press for companion legislation to impose drastic reductions in the deficit by immediate changes in the law. I see no reason to delay making the choices that will shortly be imposed if the states quickly ratify the amendment, which I think they will. So I will propose to my colleagues the following ideas. I will advocate substantial cuts in defense, especially the closing of foreign military bases that are archaic outposts of the former Cold War, and mustering out the soldiers working at those bases with an ironclad commitment that they receive benefits under the GI Bill. I want to advance severe and stringent health care cost containment legislation to contain the growth of entitlement programs such as Medicare, Medicaid, and health care for veterans by bringing about comprehensive containment of costs throughout the health care system. I believe we should terminate entire programs and departments whose missions can no longer be justified in the midst of a $4 trillion national debt. I would urge that we put existing government subsidies to corporations on a business-like footing, to cut billions in fat from programs that benefit livestock ranchers and the private sector firms which enrich uranium. Imported energy, I think, must be taxed to encourage conservation and to account for the cost of the military's protection of the sea lanes between our coast and the Middle East. And high-income individuals will once again be called on to pay their fair share. This legislation, which could accompany any consideration by the Congress of a balanced budget amendment, may not be enacted by the House or the Senate, or if it is, not signed by the President, but it ought to be debated in the context of talking about a constitutional amendment so that the public can understand the consequences of what we're about to do. I don't think they'll be frightened because I think they're way ahead of us. They don't want indebtedness to be the legacy of their children. They want them to inherit a functional government and a growing economy. And I believe they will be excited by a real departure from business as usual. And I hope my colleagues will be as well. But this will require an enormous effort, requiring all of us. At a time when the Cold War is won, when the rest of the world wants to become more like us, we must not let ourselves become a lesser economy and a lesser democracy, and I don't think we will. As Martin Luther King once said, I believe what self-centered men have torn down, other self-centered men can build up. There are other centered men and women loose in the electorate and alive in the public service who are ready to instigate real, sweeping, constructive change. But they do not operate in a vacuum, and they cannot succeed alone. Real information must be provided to the stakeholders of this country so that they can recognize and support real leadership when it's offered. Politics must be cleansed of mud and money. We need to create safe political havens for argumentation, for advancing new and controversial proposals, and for realizing big changes. The act of campaigning must be rejoined and rationalized with the art of governing. We need to restore values in this country, the values that call citizens to a larger purpose that rises above the narrow interests of the day, the values of real leadership that interprets difficult events for our people and provides lasting solutions in their deep self-interest to solve problems. Values such as rewarding excellence, supporting community, and deferring gratification. Values which come from our hearts and consciences and which are nurtured by people who teach by example. All of us, in the public, the press, elective office, academia, have a role to play, for we are all citizens, and we can all become patriots, especially when our nation needs us perhaps more than ever before. And if we come to its rescue and rally to its cause, we can plan a prosperous and united future for our people who deserve nothing less. Walter Lippmann had it right, as he nearly always did, when he observed the following nearly 60 years ago. He said, "Those who are in revolt are looking for new leaders, for men who are truthful and resolute and eloquent in the conviction that the American destiny is to be free and magnanimous rather than complacent and acquisitive. They're looking for leaders who will talk to the people about their duty and about the sacrifices they must make and about the discipline they must impose upon themselves and about their responsibility to the world and to posterity, about all these things which make a people self-respecting, serene, and confident. May they not look in vain." Amen. Thank you very much.
Let me invite you to ask questions. We have two microphones, one here and one here. I'd appreciate if people would just line up with the microphones and we'll go back and forth. So why don't we start right here?
It's good to have you here, Representative Gebhardt. You spoke about encouraging American business by having government treat business as if government was business. It seems that in the past, the Democratic Party line, and I hope it changes, has been to tell American business that it's not your fault, it's not our government's fault, it's the fault of foreigners. And how is that line going to change in this election?
Well, I hope that our party and our country, or either party and our country, never takes the position that we should blame our problems on foreigners or on someone outside the country. I think we do have legitimate issues and questions on trading relationships and access to markets, which can and should be carried out, but it never should be in the context of trying to blame someone or to take out our problems on someone. As far as our own situation, I really believe a revolution is happening in the private sector. When you see General Motors board begin to make sweeping changes in the management after they've laid off 75,000 people and closed 21 plants, you know things are beginning to happen in the private sector. I was in 8 or 10 automobile plants in the Midwest in January, and I must tell you that in some of our plants, management gets it, and they have a very cooperative, successful relationship with their employees, and they're producing high-quality products that could sell anywhere in the world and against any product in the world. There are other plants where they don't get it yet and where the product is not high in quality and the performance is not effective. I think that very same revolution that's going on in the private sector must now go on in the public sector. And I don't mean just laying people off. And I don't just mean economizing, although that's part of it. What we have to try to do is to manage government in a way that a high-quality service product is produced. One that's efficient, one that's economical, one that delivers service that cannot or will not be delivered in the private sector, and that's why the public sector is trying to do it. I think Osborne's book on reinventing government, other works that are out there lead us in the right direction. And the challenge for us in the federal government, and especially in the executive branch, because it is their responsibility, is to get managers in the departments that will begin moving the bureaucracy in a much more positive direction. I think it can be done. I think it has to be done. And I think it will be done. And when it happens, I think we'll all immeasurably benefit from it.
Bob Jenks, I'm with the National Security Program at the Kennedy School. You favor the balanced budget amendment. I'd like to know two things. One is, how would you propose to prevent various people in the government from engaging in administrative and financial sleight of hand to get around it? And secondly, how to cushion the drastic effects of such a bill on various programs from entitlements to defense to everything imaginable, and how you would go about allocating the funds once this drastic effect had been realized.
Well, first, let me say to you that I don't know there's any way to write it that someone of good mind can't get around it. That's kind of the problem with this whole discussion that we've been engaged in for a long, long time. We have passed Graham-Rudman 1 and 2, and probably if we don't do an amendment, we'll do 3 and 4 and 5. And there's always a way to get around it, because there's no way to do this that is ironclad. And I worry about that with an amendment. But let me say to you that after having argued against an amendment for 15 years now, I find it hard to argue against it today for the following reasons. One, what we've done legislatively hasn't worked. We have created altogether more debt in the last 10 years than we did in the whole 200 years of the Republic before that time. I was the chairman of the budget summit that we had in 1990. We cut spending, that was 2/3 of the deficit reduction. We raised taxes, that was 1/3. We pretty well angered everybody in the country, which meant it probably worked pretty well. And at the end of the exercise, rather than marching toward a balanced budget in 5 years, which is what we thought we were doing, this year we have a $400 billion deficit. The interest cost in the budget, as I said a moment ago, is now $300 billion a year. This thing is now growing exponentially. We're in hyperspace. And all the experts say that if we do nothing but enforce the 1990 budget agreement, that while the deficit might go down a little bit in 93, 4, and 5, thereafter, because of health care costs primarily, it'll go straight through the stratosphere. So we're in trouble. We got to do something. We have to get our hands around this thing. And I was taught in college, and maybe it wasn't right, but when I took economics, they said that the federal budget ought to be balanced, or more or less balanced, in most years. That when the economy is running pretty well, the budget ought to be pretty much balanced. We've just gone through 10 years in which the economy apparently was working pretty well. Now, maybe it wasn't, and we had to paper over the fact that it wasn't by adding debt. But all of the indicators were that we had strong growth. We created $1 trillion of debt. Unbelievable. So, the one thing the amendment may do is create a presumption that we should have a balanced budget. I don't know that it'll do much more than that, but that may be worth it. A rebuttable presumption that the budget in normal circumstances should be at or near balance. And then, you know, if you want to do something else, you can do it. Now, I'm not sure we want a supermajority and we can get into all those arguments, but at least there'll be a presumption. Today we have a presumption that it should be unbalanced, and right now it should be wildly unbalanced. And I think that's a bad place to wind up, and one that's going to leave us in a hole that we'll never dig out of. I'll say one other thing to you. I think this issue has finally begun to penetrate deep into the population. I gave speech after speech after speech in 1981 saying Reaganomics will produce what it's produced. And I got hooted down in most audiences saying you're just not a believer, you don't understand supply side, you're a naysayer, blah, blah, blah. And I'm not, it doesn't matter who was right and who was wrong. The point was nobody wanted to hear about it. I used to say to campaign consultants, this is a salient issue. You can run a campaign on balancing the budget. They said, no, people don't care about it. Go talk about Social Security, talk about cutting taxes, talk about things people want to hear. For the first time in the last year, I have ordinary citizens, working people, not bankers and economists, who come up and say, just berate me, legitimately. What are you doing about this deficit? It's going to eat us alive. We're going to pass this on to our children. We shouldn't be doing this. It's immoral. So I think we can build a constituency to do some of these things. And that's why I think doing the amendment alone is a gimmick. It's in a way, it's not true to the mark. We need to put with it a bill that really puts you on a path, a real path, not a theoretical path, but a real path that you can see a balanced budget in 3 or 4 years, as we thought we were doing in 1990. But to do it, you've got to go at all the parts of the equation. And as you well said, it's got to be entitlements, it's got to be discretionary domestic spending, defense spending, and I think revenues, so that you touch all the parts of the equation and you show people what this is going to mean and what it's going to take.
So you're saying it's going to be a consensual sort of thing as far as what's going to get cut over time?
Well, let me just describe to you again what I said here, which I think are 4 feasible steps. I for one, think it's infeasible to go to people and say we're going to cut everybody's Social Security pension. It isn't going to work. It isn't going to happen. It isn't going to work. I'll give you all the substantive arguments about why you shouldn't do it. I think whether you believe the substance of the politics, it's a non-starter. Is not going to happen. Should not happen. I do think the greatest cause of entitlement increase is health care spending. It is exploding. Now, I believe we have to deal with all health care costs, public sector, private sector together. We have to deal with the whole equation. That would be a huge piece to bring the budget back into the stratosphere. Second, we have to have major drawbacks in defense. Third, we have to cut other domestic programs, either across the board or taking out entire agencies. And fourth, I think we have to deal with taxes in terms of high-end income taxes and energy taxes. I would like an oil import fee. Others argue for a gasoline tax. I think the oil import fee has the better of the argument. I think it contributes to environmental issues and energy issues and budget issues. I think it's a triple header. That's the way I'd go about it. Yes.
Hello, Congressman Gephardt. I would like to compliment you for speaking of fiscal responsibility and of perhaps privatizing some services were previously public. However, that kind of strikes me as a turnaround, considering that you mentioned 1964 and 1965 as kind of the golden age of the Congress when we had the Great Society programs. Those programs did spend a lot of money in the war on poverty, but they did not solve the problem of poverty. You speak of a revolution and having a united government as the way to solve the problems of our government. However, I do not see, as the Democratic Party has controlled Congress through the Great Society and through the 80s, why your party is the one to create this privatization.
Well, only Nixon could go to China, so maybe the Democrats are the ones to straighten out the domestic programs. I would say, let me just say two comments on what you said. First, I don't agree with you entirely that the Great Society was a failure. I think some of it failed, some of it succeeded. I would argue to you that when it was in full force, poverty was lowered a great deal. Education was improved. Certainly health care was improved because one of those Great Society programs was Medicare, which has succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. So a lot of it did work, but all of it didn't. You're right in that sense. All of it didn't, and we should be willing to look back and say what worked and what didn't work. Thereafter, President Nixon and others changed some of those programs and put some of the decision-making at the local level. And I think a lot of that was right and did work. And we learned from that, and maybe we need to look at that model again. Finally, let me say, we should not pull back from the need to have a commitment to solve problems because we haven't yet figured out how to perfectly do it. And I'm afraid there's a lot of that going on. People saying, that wasn't perfect, therefore we can't do anything. Because I think what you see in Los Angeles and in other places around the country, and what you've seen for a long time, is that we have not gotten at the core of many of these domestic problems. We haven't gotten at the heart of it. And it seems to me that we have to remain committed to that in order to solve the problem. I fully accept that government hasn't been run correctly, that we have had waste, that we've had abuse, that we haven't managed people correctly, we haven't motivated them, we haven't gotten the performance from government employees that we need and want. I'd also admit that there are things that government is trying to do that might be done in some cases by the private sector better. And we need to either hire the private sector to do it or get them to do it. But having said all of that, I hope we won't recoil from the commitment to attack these problems. Because if we fail to attack them, they will eat us alive. And I must tell you, I think this tenuous democracy that we have, and it may be more tenuous than any of us think, I think the glue that holds it together is what I mentioned by David Potter, and that's the politics of abundance. Not a guarantee of abundance, but a guarantee of an opportunity for abundance. And if people really begin to believe in this country, as I think many are, that there's no guarantee of an opportunity for abundance, then I think this great diverse democracy, which is still an experiment, flies apart. Flies apart. And so the commitment, the intention to want to solve these problems, I think has to remain there and right in front among all of us.
If I may ask kind of a related question.
Well, I think one question. We have more people than we're going to have time. Thank you.
Okay, hi, thanks. I'm Tricia Reedy, and it was nice to hear you. I want to commend you for your courage and foresight. One area is in the economic aid you proposed to the Soviet Union while President Bush was still waiting in the sidelines, waiting to see if the Cold War was going to stick around. And my concern is along those lines about the U.S. role in tough economic times in contributing to international security, economic security, and military security, particularly in our support for the United Nations, which works for human rights, peace, and economic security for the world's citizens. So I have two questions. One, is the U.S. Congress under your leadership going to continue to fulfill its obligations to the UN in general? And I'm thinking specifically of a case like Cambodia, where there's a historic UN plan brought about by years of negotiation and cooperation of superpowers and regional powers, and a country that we spent years bombing, and 700,000 people were purported to have died under that. Are we going to, in these tough economic times, not pay our reasonable due to help bring stability to the region, which will benefit the people and also us in the long term?
I think we will pay our dues, and I think the President will support that, and I would commend him for what he did in the Persian Gulf situation. I voted against going to use force, but nonetheless, I really felt he did the right thing in working through the United Nations, and I hope that's a pattern that we will continue to follow, and that model certainly reinforced the value of the United Nations for the entire world. Let me add one other thing. I believe, as I said in a speech at Northwestern University a few weeks ago, that we have to always tie our foreign policy to our domestic economic policy. It is essential that we do that for two reasons. One, if the American people are going to continue to be convinced that it is in their self-interest to be involved in the world, as in the case of helping the former Soviet Union, they have to be convinced that there's a growing economic pie, politics of abundance, here in the United States. That's A. B, our politics of abundance is what I think other democracies around the world reach for. I don't think that our rearmament in the 80s is the main reason that the Soviet Empire crumbled. I'm not criticizing it, and it may have needed to have been done. I don't think it needed to be done to the extent it was done, but I won't quarrel with that. But I quarrel with the idea that what toppled the Soviet Union and communism was that we had more missiles, or better missiles than they had, or better warheads. I think what ultimately toppled communism was that people over television saw the politics of abundance and wanted it badly, and brought about the change in that society from underneath. And that becomes another reason that we have to keep our economy strong if we're to have a successful foreign policy. So to keep our own constituency, to do the right things in order to provide the right example to the rest of the world of what democracy can yield, I think the domestic economic issues are central to having a proper foreign policy, and not the least of which is the ability to pay the dues to the United Nations. Yes.
Good evening, Mr. Gebhardt. My name's Fred McLeod. I'd like to speak to you about the goals of the Democratic Party, especially as it refers not only to congressional elections, but the presidential area. I'm really what you'd call a yellow dog Democrat, the type of person the Democratic Party has been losing since 1968, and it's a pleasure to have to see you and ask you this, and I plea with you this. Since 1968, the Democratic Party has listened to a very small, screaming, vocal group of people that has led the party to elect leaders that just are totally unacceptable. And, you know, people like myself, I'm a working man, and I've worked hard all my life and never stopped working. And we really want to be Democrats, and since 1968 I've had to hold my nose and vote Republican because what the Democratic Party put forward filled me with utter and absolute revulsion. I beg you, if nothing else, try as a leader to get the party back to common sense. We'll vote for a common sense yellow dog. A dog has common sense. But some of the ultra left-wing and insane ideas that the party has come up with, and you know, right here, and I'm a real JFK and Martin Luther King Democrat. All I'm asking is, can you as a leader please work to get, what I'm asking is to give the party back to us, bring it back to us, because this year I don't have to hold my nose. There's a third option. Thank you.
I understand. Let me urge you to, if you haven't done it already, to give a hard others. And Bill Clinton was an important part of that effort to broaden the party, to speak to a broader group of Americans. He is now going to be our nominee, and he comes from that background. He also has been a governor of a Midwestern southern state. He's been a progressive governor. He has attacked a lot of the problems I've talked about tonight, I think creatively and honestly, and has gotten some good results. He was on the House floor last week. There were a lot of doubters in the room, and there weren't many left when the meeting was over. Because when you see him and really listen to him, and I ask that you do that, people came away saying, this guy's for real. He can do this. He could be a good president. He could attack these problems and do some things that need to be done. I am personally excited about the prospect of being able to serve in the Congress if I am reelected with a Bill Clinton. I think we could really begin to move this country in a positive direction in many of these very important challenges. So I urge you, before you make your decision in this election, to give him a very, very serious hard look and watch him and listen to him and read what he's saying. Yes.
I'm George Samaripa. I'm the chairman of the Democratic Party in Cambridge. Welcome.
Good.
And a strong supporter of the Schroeder-Gephardt amendment for the test ban in 86. I'd like to ask you to think in terms of the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the defeat of Iraq, which was the largest third world army, and think in terms of a real peacetime American military. And I think if you and your staff were willing to take a look, in a sense, a Carter sense of a zero budget basis, you would find that we would have the strongest military in the world for a price that might be something on the order of $60 or $70 billion a year, far lower than anything that even Ron Dellums has proposed, because I think everybody else is looking at what can you get through Congress this year, what can you propose. But I think that it would be very powerful if you were to look at it starting over again and recognizing that we really have been through a very difficult period, somewhat similar to World War II. Now the Cold War is over, and I'd like to ask you if you could think about that or even speak about it.
Sure.
Because it is within the power of one House with a majority to hold that part of the budget down.
We have, I think, in the House with Les Aspin, tried to begin looking at the defense budget for the future through a different filter. And we need to engage with the Pentagon in that thinking. We need to try to find a way that we can change the way we think about defense. Les tried to suggest the idea that we look at it in Iraq equivalence, whatever that is. And, excuse me, and that has been a worthy exercise. We need that to continue. We need it to broaden. We need to involve more citizens in that. And if we can do that, I think we could come up with different and better budgets in defense. But it won't happen unilaterally. And we can't do it by just discussing it among ourselves in the House. We need to engage the Pentagon. We need to engage the public. I'm from St. Louis. We have McDonnell Douglas. McDonnell Douglas has laid off 10,000 people in the last year, highly paid people. Another part of this is conversion. How do we move our economy in a different direction? Soviets faced this, to the 10th power. We at least have some options that we can deal with. But we're not dealing with it very well. It's very hard to get anybody to discuss seriously with you defense conversion, what it means, how to do it, how to bring it about, what works, what doesn't work, what's silly. And so that discussion needs to go on. If there was ever a time for democracy to really work and to engage a large group, cross-section of our society in a discussion, it is over this issue. And to my mind, it is not yet happening. The only discussion is about, I don't want to lose jobs in my district. Well, that's great, but that doesn't get us anywhere. That isn't the answer. What is defense? What is security in the year 2000? What will it take? What are the threats? How many of them are there? How many of them do you want to fight at one time? If you accept Les's thing or something like, how many Iraqs can happen, and how many of them do you want to fight at one time? That's the kind of analysis that we need to go through, and you're right in offering that question, because it really should be on our minds.
We are running out of time. We're only going to really have time for two more. Airline schedules are the dictating factor.
Several studies, including a recent one in the New England Journal of Medicine, which looked at prescriptions for nursing home residents, have shown that arbitrary caps can have severe implications for health. In light of this, could you expand on your ideas for healthcare cost containment and explain how, without complementary health insurance reform, such adverse consequences can be avoided?
Ideally, I think what we need is two things. One, a societal, national decision on how much we will allow health care costs to go up year over year, as the Germans do. The Germans, the one thing the federal government there does is decides how much costs should go up. In other words, they set a national budget. They then send that down to the local level, and they carry on, as they do on many things, a negotiation between the providers, hospitals, doctors, pharmaceutical companies, and the sickness funds, and they work it out. And as I often tell audiences, you hope they work it out so the dumb things aren't done and the smart things are done. Now, we all know that in the real world that it doesn't work that perfectly, but that's what you hope for. But if you don't have a limit, if you don't define a budget for health care, then I think nothing happens. And I say this from experience. I led the fight on the floor in 1978 against Jimmy Carter's hospital cost containment for two reasons. One, it only affected hospitals and not the pharmaceuticals and the physicians. And second, the private sector came to us and said, give competition a chance. We can handle this problem. Well, it's been 14 years, and they handled it. Costs are now, in some parts of the country, going up 30, 40% a year. It's exploding. If we don't do something, if we just stand still, the health care costs for the average family will be $8,000, $10,000 a year. So we have to set a cap, and we have to find ways, hopefully, that will allow smart things to continue and dumb things to fall out. Second, we have to increase access. We have to get, as the Germans do, everybody covered by something. And the way I say this is today we have, some people have Cadillac coverage, some people have Oldsmobile, some people have Chevrolet, some people ride a bike, and some people walk. In Germany, everybody at least has a Chevrolet or a Volkswagen. And then if you want to buy a Mercedes on top of that, you can. That's where we need to wind up if we possibly can. To people who say that's, welfare and socialized medicine, I would just say this to you. Medicine, I reluctantly conclude, is not like anything else. If you go down to the corner here and you buy a car, you walk in and say, I want a new Ford. And they say, fine, we'll have it at 3 o'clock, it costs $16,000, and you say, well, I have no money, but have it ready at 3 o'clock, they tell you get lost. If you get sick and go down here to the hospital emergency room, and they say you have a heart problem, and you say, I have no money, they take care of you. We do not let people die, nor should we. And so it's a different commodity, and I think as a society we have to require that everybody have at least a Chevrolet.
It's going to be a very short question and a short answer.
Okay.
I had a question about the upcoming presidential election. One of the things we keep reading and hearing is that Bush's popularity is at an all-time low and that the Democrats are in a stronger position than they've been recently to win the presidency. And yet the people who emerged as the candidates tended to be kind of running from outside, and some of the household Democratic leadership names didn't surface and run, and I was wondering why you thought that some of the more obvious leadership chose not to run for presidency.
In every case, everybody has an individual choice. You self-nominate for this process in our country, and for various reasons, different people decided not to run, and probably for all different reasons. But I would urge you to believe that an awful lot of very high quality and good candidates did run, that it doesn't matter that they were not household words or names before they ran, and that the process has produced a very high quality candidate, and we have a great chance to win. Don't believe any of the polls today. They're absolutely irrelevant and meaningless. People have not focused on this race. They haven't even begun to look at it. And I just hope when they do, it will not just be a race about a popularity contest, a personality contest, but will also be a contest about where the country's going, what the consequences of the election are, and what kind of future you want the country to have. Personalities are important, but also what they're wanting to do with the country is also important. And if this election can be about consequences, whatever the outcome, I will be happy, and I think we will improve the election process a great deal. It's been a great pleasure to be here tonight. Your questions have been excellent. It's been my honor. Thank you very much.